Hi friends, welcome to Chapter 4, The Perception Process, or Perceiving Others. In this chapter, we'll explore the influences on our perceptions, common tendencies of human perceptions, and synchronizing our perceptions. In addition, we will look at communication as a means for bridging perceptual differences between individuals. So let's go ahead and get started with the perception process. To a certain extent, our sense of reality or our perception of reality is constructed. So what do we mean that reality is constructed? Essentially, we're all exposed to first-order realities. These are physical observable qualities of a thing or a situation. Take, for example, the rising and setting of the sun, which is a naturally occurring phenomenon based on planetary orbits. Second-order realities are humans' interpretations of those first-order realities, or the meaning we attach to those situations. So what does it mean the sun rises and sets? In ancient civilizations, they believed that this was due to some sort of divine intervention by, the sun god or something. And so they attached meaning to what they were observing. Similarly, we attach meaning to communication processes that we encounter. So let's say you walk through the quad and you notice two people are sitting really close together, maybe cuddling. Now, this is a physical observable quality, where this is the first order reality. Now, when we walk past, let's say, this couple, we attach meaning to that. And so we might interpret that behavior, as, oh, they're a couple, or they're, emotionally connected to each other. Or, we observe maybe a couple having an intense argument, and we attach meaning to that. And we might arrive to the conclusion that they're having, issues in the relationship. And so really this distinction between first order realities and second order realities really has to do with our interpretations of what we're exposed to. And so second order realities don't necessarily reside in objects or events, but rather in our minds. It's how we attach meaning or interpret a particular situation. So it's always important to take note of our perception process and how we arrive to conclusions, because it's easy to assign meaning to a particular situation and having that inaccurate interpretation of what's taking place. So this brings me to a second construct developed by Luckman and Berger, and they were sociologists back in the 60s. And they developed a social construction of reality framework. And this explains how when humans are exposed to external stimuli, we have to make sense through it. So we have to make sense of it. So we internalize it and use our language to communicate about that external phenomena. By virtue of internalizing it and using language to talk about it, these occurring first order realities become objectified. And when society gravitates towards that same language as a whole, then these abstract concepts almost become solidified in that society. They become established trains of thoughts or interpretations. Consequently, that third step is where when we are in society, we internalize the objective world that has been subjectively created as our internal experiences. So this is another fascinating concept. It's not really touched on the book, so I'm not going to give it too much attention in this presentation. So how do our perceptions develop? Essentially, it's a four-step process. The first step being selection. We are exposed to a lot of different data in our everyday lives. And so we naturally select stimuli or data that we pay attention to. Some stimuli that influences our selection process includes things that are really intense, things that repeat, or things that stand out in contrast. take, for example, the pictures on this slide. Chances are you selected the yellow umbrella first, is because it stood in contrast compared to all the other umbrellas. So data, the type of stimuli that we're subjected to, does influence our selection process, what we pay attention to. The video clip on this slide illustrates this concept. This is a brief awareness test, and I think you would find it really amusing to watch. So when we have selected stimuli or data to pay attention to, we then organize that information. We organize it based on perceptual schemas or cognitive frameworks that give order to information. The way I like to think about it are filing cabinets jammed in our brain. And so we sort all this information into these perceptual schemas. Some of the perceptual schemas that the book talks about include physical constructs, role constructs, interaction constructs, or psychological constructs. So after we have organized information, our next step is the interpretation. And this is where we simply attach meaning to the data or the stimuli. And so there are a lot of different influences and considerations that might change our interpretation. First of which is relational satisfaction. So we see that research has shown couples in really satisfying relationships, like happy relationships, they tend to interpret their partner's behavior more positively than individuals in a dissatisfactory relationship. So couples in an unhappy relationship tend to interpret their partner's behavior more negatively. We see that expectations can also influence the meaning we attach to data. Just think of chapter 3 when we talked about self-fulfilling prophecies or the cognitive triangle, and how our expectations really influence the way we interpret and assign meaning to those situations. We also see that personal experiences, like our past experiences, also influence how we interpret things that are taking place currently. And then lastly, our overall assumptions about human behavior and our expectations on how people behave in society and what's appropriate or inappropriate, and that can influence the way we attach meaning to particular situations. The fourth step is the negotiation process. And this is a process by which communicators influence each other's perceptions through communication. One way we do this is through the exchange of stories, which are often called narratives. And so the best example that I can share with you is a hypothetical situation. So let's say you and a friend go see a movie. You observe that first order reality, but you walk away with two second order realities or different second order realities. You thought the movie was great. Your friend thought it was horrible. And so after the movie, you're discussing with your friend why you thought the movie was good. And you might provide supporting evidence to support your opinion. Consequently, your friend is going to also communicate their reasons for why the movie was horrible. And through that interaction, you might be able to appreciate each other's perspectives. Even though you might not agree with them, you might walk away with a deeper understanding of the film or your friend's perspective. So another example that illustrates this perception process really looks at our expectations and how our language can shape our expectations and the way we interpret certain events. Now, this isn't explicitly stated in the textbook, but this is a research article by Lee and Schwarz in 2014. And essentially, their research looked at how couples or relationships used metaphorical frameworks to conceptualize their relationship. in order to enhance sense making. And so if you think about it, we really use metaphors in our everyday language to talk about things. So what they were looking at are two specific metaphors that frame relationships, either the unity metaphor, such as this person is my soulmate, it's destiny, we're meant to be together, or the journey metaphor, where individuals look at their relationship as a journey through life that might have ups and downs, difficulties, setbacks, triumphs, and so forth. And essentially giving their different interpretations of relationships based on the metaphors they use to describe the relationship influences their expectations for conflict and the meaning they assign to conflict. And so their results showed that individuals with the unity metaphor had lower levels of satisfaction in their relationship immediately after a conflict, is because that conflict challenged their conceptual understanding of their relationship. On the contrary, individuals with the journey metaphor, they didn't see too much variation in their relational satisfaction levels, primarily because that metaphor of a journey already takes into account that conflict is a natural process of growth. So I thought this was really interesting in how just our language can really shape our expectations for certain things. This also ties into expectancy violation theory by Judy Burgoon. I think I touched on that in chapter 3 as well. So what are some influences on human perception? Well, we have our physiological influences. This includes our senses, right? Sight, smell, taste, hearing. All of those can influence how we perceive things. Age, we see that when we progress through age, some of the senses decrease in their effectiveness. So when we get older, we might experience hearing loss. And again, that can influence the way we perceive things. Health and fatigue is another biological influence on our perception process. When we are in poor health, so maybe we're sick or we have the flu, that really diminishes our ability to select that data, process that data, organize it, and attach meaning. Hunger, I don't know about you, but when I have to sit in class early in the mornings or, during lunchtime, I get hangry, hungry and angry at the same time. That influences how present I am in that classroom, and it makes it harder to process information. We could see biological cycles as an influential factor in the perception process. So specifically sleep patterns. Research has found that over 75% of individuals on college campuses across the US are sleep deprived. That means majority of us are not getting 8 hours of sleep. That's probably you. I know it's for sure me. And so when we're sleep deprived, again, that really affects our ability to perceive things accurately. And then we have psychological challenges as well, such as anxiety or rapid thoughts, which make it hard to stay in the moment and be able to accurately arrive to a conclusion. We have psychological influences on perceptions. So this includes our mood. So the mood that we're in during the day can influence how we perceive things. So if we're in a positive mood, we're more likely to interpret things more positively. And when we're in a negative mood, that also filters our interpretations more negatively. Also, our self-concepts, how self-esteem can also influence our perceptions. On the right is just an example of a research study that looked at self-concept and how it related to interpretation of teasing. So individuals with low self-esteem had higher perceptions of victimization, especially related to teasing. Then there's the broader influences on our perceptions, and this is society. And so society as a whole places certain expectations on us, which influence our perception. So think about sex and gender roles, and what society says about our roles based on our sex or gender. Occupational roles also influences our perception. So you might think how, various occupational roles influence how individuals view the world and organize information. There's relational roles, cultural norms. All of these things can influence our perception. The link called the Ash experiment, this is a really fascinating study that looks at social conformity and how that influences our perceptions of first order realities. And so Ash experiment really looked at this group conformity and how if the group, even if their interpretations are wrong, if they're leaning towards one answer, individuals tend to just follow the group even if they know the group is wrong. So I invite you to watch that experiment. There's newer social experiments that kind of follow Solomon's Ash original experience. So you could probably just YouTube Solomon and Ash and see a bunch of fun experiments. Okay, so we have covered what perceptions are, how they develop, and some common influences on our perception process. Now, when we are dealing with perceptions, research has found that there are common tendencies in how we approach our perceptions. So the first one is that we make snap judgments. And the way that I think of snap judgments essentially is jumping to a conclusion without enough data to support that conclusion. And while we do this, and we probably will continue to do this as humans, I think it really stems from a biological evolutionary psychology, if that's a thing, as a survival mechanism. And so, if we hear a bush rustle next to us, like something's in the bush, we aren't going to stick around to find out what's in that bush because potentially it could be a lion. And so over, the evolution of humans, we find ourselves in today's modern society not threatened by, what's in a bush, or we don't need to outrun a tiger. We don't need to always be in this heightened state of awareness. However, our brains, our biology is still wired to do that. And so oftentimes we make snap judgments. And that is, again, jumping to conclusions without gathering sufficient data, right? So another example, let's say it's late at night and you're leaving campus and you're walking to your car. It's dark out and you notice someone is walking behind you. Are you going to stop and hang out and, talk to this stranger? Chances are no. You're going to jump to the conclusion that this person could potentially be a threat to you. When in fact, maybe this is just another tired student walking to the same parking lot so that they can go home. So again, we make snap judgments all the time. It doesn't make them right or wrong, but I'm hoping that after we have gone through this information, that we're more in tune to our own perceptions so that we can check ourselves to make sure that, am I gathering enough information to support this judgment or this conclusion? And I think from this process, stereotypes are formed. And so stereotypes are making just broad assumptions about a particular group of people with very limited information. We even saw that in chapter 2 with Adichie's TED Talk, where a single story of a particular people often leads to these overarching stereotypes of a whole culture of individuals. We cling to first impressions. This is taken and accounted for by the primacy effect. And this is our tendency to pay attention to information that happens first in a sequence. And throughout that sequence, our attention span decreases. So I always tell my public speaking students, make sure your introduction to a speech is solid. Also, the conclusion, because chances are those are the two important elements of a speech that the audience will remember. Everything in between is going to probably be blurred for them. They're going to probably forget what details you shared. So keep the introduction really tight and also the conclusion really tight, is because of this primacy effect. We typically only pay attention to things that happen first in a sequence. Another first impression tendency that we see is the halo effect. And this is essentially creating an overall positive impression of a person simply based on one positive characteristic that this person has. So maybe this person is very attractive, and after the first time talking with this attractive person, we develop an overall positive impression of them. Or maybe they're really outgoing or funny, right? It doesn't mean that this person is a good person. Similarly, we have the horns effect, and this is the opposite to the halo effect. The horns effect is when we essentially develop a overall negative impression of someone simply based on one negative quality, or based on that first impression that we've experienced. Now, this could be contributed to this confirmation bias, where we naturally select data to support our initial impressions. And so if you perceive someone to be rude, you're going to scrutinize their behavior and cherry pick all the things that they do in order to prove to yourself that your initial expectation or hypothesis of this person is correct. And that's, again, confirmation bias. We also judge ourselves more charitably than we do others. And so this is taken into consideration by two really interesting concepts. The first one is the fundamental attribution error. And this is the tendency people have to overemphasize personal characteristics and ignore situational factors in judging others' behavior. So let's say you have a coworker who's constantly showing up late to work. It's so easy to overemphasize personal characteristics and say, this person is super lazy, or they aren't good at time management because they're always showing up late, right? While ignoring the situational factors. Maybe this person has a second job, or maybe they just came to the hospital for caring for a parent or something, or maybe they have other responsibilities. So this fundamental attribution error is when we typically associate personal characteristics rather than taking into account situational factors. Similarly, we have the self-serving bias, and this is the common habit of a person taking credit for positive events or outcomes, but blaming outside factors for negative events, right? So if you got a promotion at work, the self-serving bias person would say, oh, it's because all of my hard work, right? If a person didn't get that promotion, it's because my manager's a jerk, or the system's rigged, or whatever the case is. It's putting blame on external factors. We're also influenced by our expectations. We're also influenced by the obvious. And so this video is a clip from Men in Black that illustrates this. In this video clip, if you decide to watch it, just be mindful that there's a lot of flashing lights in the video. So if you are sensitive to light, just be aware of that. We also assume others are like us. And so we assume, because if we have a view or perception of the world, or communication, or relationship, or what it means to be a good employee, we assume other people hold those same perceptions, when in fact they don't. So there's a lot of influences on the perception process. We all experience reality different based on our own subjective interpretations. So how do we synchronize our perceptions, especially if they're different from someone else? And so we do this through perception checking. And this is a good way to check our assumptions about other people's behavior and share our interpretations at the same time so that we can clarify and arrive to a mutual understanding when it comes to other people's behavior. I think this is really important for building empathy. And so we know that empathy is the ability to create another person's perspective or experiences within ourselves. So it's essentially placing ourselves in someone else's experiences and trying to understand the world from their point of view. So what is the perception checking process? How do we synchronize our perceptions with other people? Well, this is a 3-step process. So when you arrive to a situation and you do not know how to interpret people's behavior, or you want to avoid making assumptions or jumping to those conclusions or making those snap judgments, it's best to approach this person and describe what you observed. Essentially describe the behavior you have observed. And so let's say a friend walked out of the room without saying goodbye, or maybe a partner came home, slammed the door, went straight upstairs without even acknowledging your presence. And so you might approach this individual and just describe what you observed. You aren't judging, you aren't criticizing, you aren't evaluating. You're simply describing what you saw from your point of view. Next is when you offer 2 possible interpretations. So this is where you get to share how you're interpreting their behavior. And the 3rd step is to ask for clarification. So let me go ahead and share with you what this would look like in a scenario. So let's take that first scenario. Let's say a partner comes home, slams the door, runs straight upstairs without acknowledging your presence. So you might approach your partner later and say, "Hey, partner, I noticed that when you came home, that you slammed the door, went straight upstairs without saying hi to me." You're describing the behavior. Were you upset? Or was there something I did that, offended you? Or did you not see me? Right? There's a ton of different interpretations we could share. I'm having a difficult time interpreting this. What's up? What's going on? Right? And so the partner might share that with you, that they really had to use the bathroom. It was an emergency. Maybe they had exploding diarrhea. I don't know, right? But you're giving them the opportunity to clarify or to explain themselves. And this helps us to stay out of judgment or misinterpret their behavior, because it's so easy to view that behavior as negative. So the perception checking process is a very simple 3-step process that we can start implementing in our everyday conversations and interactions that will help clarify what we're being exposed to and the perceptions that we're developing. With any communication skill, it's going to seem awkward the first few times that you implement this, but the more practice and the more times that you use this process, it emerges naturally, and you can get more creative with this. So this is again, it's very descriptive. It's very formulaic. So the first time that you use it, it's going to be awkward, but when you feel more comfortable using this, chances are it'll save a lot of drama and misinterpretations in your everyday conversations. Okay, so let's briefly talk about empathy and how that's important for perceptions, right? So we know that empathy is the ability to recreate another person's perspectives or experiences of their world from their point of view. Again, placing ourselves in their situation in order to understand them more deeply. So this is an example of empathy and sympathy using the context of nursing, a nurse and patient interaction. So we see that empathy is a great quality to have within the medical field. In fact, patient satisfaction and care is also correlated with how empathetic the healthcare worker or the medical staff are. So empathy is relating to your patient because you had a similar experience, right? Whereas sympathy is just simply trying to comfort a person. So to share a little bit more about empathy, I linked a video from Dr. Brene Brown, who has done extensive research on empathy, vulnerability, and how those two concepts really help mitigate shame within our lives. So how do we build empathy? Well, it requires open-mindedness, similar to intercultural communication competence, having that attitude and that motivation, being open to the possibility that other people might be approaching certain situations or the world differently. They might be assigning different meaning to these things. And it's not our position to judge, but to try to understand. Another really important element for building empathy is using our imagination. You might be talking to a friend who has gone through something that you've never experienced in your life. So how can we relate? Well, we can imagine what it would feel like if we went through that situation. And also commitment. Being committed to really trying to understand someone. Not just, offering lip service or saying, oh yeah, I completely understand, but really ask those meaningful questions such as, how did this make you feel? How did you respond? What are the consequences? How is this shaping your perceptions? So asking really deep, meaningful questions shows commitment in trying to understand someone. And again, by doing that, that empathy naturally emerges. So here are 5 concrete steps in building empathy. Watch and listen. Remember a time when you felt a similar way, or imagine what it must feel like if you can't identify something that is relatable. Try to imagine how you might feel in that situation. Ask those deep, meaningful questions, and then show that you care. Take into consideration your nonverbal communication. So you might turn your body to face the person. You might get on the same eye level. You might nod your head, engage in eye contact. All of these nonverbal elements is communicating that you care for this person. So this chapter, we covered perceptions. So we briefly described what perceptions are, how we develop perceptions, influences on our perceptions, some common tendencies of perceptions, how to synchronize our communication, or synchronize our perceptions, and communicating as a means of bridging perceptual differences by using that perception checking process. Thank you so much for paying attention, and we'll see you next time.